Alistair Sterling was one of the richest men in the world, a titan of industry whose name was synonymous with ruthless efficiency and unparalleled success. He could move markets with a single phone call and build empires from the dust of his rivals. But for all his power, for all his boundless wealth, no amount of money could fix his son. After firing 7 of the country's most qualified and expensive caregivers in as many months, despair had become the permanent resident of his sprawling, silent mansion. His 8-year-old son, Leo, was dying, and Alistair was forced to watch the slow, inexorable fade. The diagnosis was as rare as it was cruel: progressive neuroencephalopathy, a disease that was stealing his son's mind, his body, and his future, with a prognosis of 3 months left to live. Then a woman named Elara Vance showed up for the 8th interview. She was nothing like the others. She had no prestigious degrees, no glowing letters from celebrity clients. She had a quiet sort of sadness in her eyes that mirrored his own, and a past that was clearly etched with its own pain. He hired her on a desperate whim, a final futile gesture against the coming dark. He had no idea that her arrival would trigger a shocking series of events that would not only expose a devastating lie, but would break him completely before building him anew. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. The Sterling estate was less a home and more a monument to grief. Perched on a cliff overlooking the turbulent gray Atlantic, the house was a marvel of modern architecture, all glass, steel, and stark white marble. It was designed to be filled with light, but inside, a perpetual twilight seemed to reign. Every surface was polished to a sterile sheen, every piece of furniture placed with geometric precision. It felt like a museum, a place where life was observed but never truly lived. Since his wife Amelia's death 2 years prior, Alistair had systematically stripped the house of her warmth, as if her memory were a pain too sharp to bear. The vibrant paintings were replaced with abstract sculptures, the plush rugs with cold stone, the family photographs with empty, reflective surfaces. Elara Vance felt the chill of the place the moment she stepped through the towering front doors. It seeped into her bones, a cold that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze. She clutched the strap of her simple leather bag, her knuckles white. The butler, a man whose posture was as rigid as the marble columns flanking the hall, led her through cavernous rooms where the only sound was the echo of their footsteps. She was accustomed to sterile environments, to the quiet hum of medical machinery. But this was different. This was a place hollowed out by loss. Alistair Sterling stood waiting for her in his study, a room that felt more like a corporate boardroom. He was framed by a floor-to-ceiling window that offered a panoramic view of the storm-tossed sea. He was tall and impeccably dressed, but his face was drawn, his eyes shadowed, with a fatigue that went beyond mere lack of sleep. It was the exhaustion of a man locked in a battle he knew he was losing. He didn't offer her a seat. He simply stared, his gaze analytical, dismissive. "Your resume is sparse," he said, his voice a low baritone that held no warmth. He held the single sheet of paper between his thumb and forefinger, as if it were a distasteful object. "I have experience," Elara replied, her own voice soft but steady. "I am a hard worker. I've had the most experienced pediatric nurses in the country. They were all hard workers. They all failed." He tossed the resume onto the massive mahogany desk. "My son, Leo, is non-responsive. He requires round-the-clock medical care, feeding tube, monitoring, medication schedule. He doesn't see, he doesn't hear, he doesn't react. The doctors say his cognitive function is negligible. Your job is to administer his protocol and ensure he is comfortable. Nothing more." The finality in his tone was like a door slamming shut. He was warning her not to hope, not to try. He was hiring a custodian for his dying child. Elara felt a familiar ache in her chest, a phantom pain from a wound that never truly healed. She thought of her own brother, Daniel, of the doctors with their grim pronouncements and the slow, terrible dimming of a light that should have burned for a lifetime. "I understand," she said, meeting his gaze without flinching. Something in her quiet resolve seemed to catch him off guard. He had expected supplication, or perhaps the cloying sympathy of the previous applicants. Ilara offered neither. She simply stood there, a small island of calm in his ocean of turmoil. He didn't know why, but he heard himself say, "The job is yours. You'll start tomorrow. You'll live on site. The West Wing." He dismissed her with a curt nod, turning back to the window as if she had already ceased to exist. Ilara's first meeting with Leo was in a room that felt even colder than the rest of the house. The curtains were drawn, casting the space in a permanent gloom. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic. A bank of medical monitors blinked and beeped with a monotonous rhythm, the only sign of life in the funereal stillness. Leo lay in a state-of-the-art hospital bed, small and still beneath a crisp white sheet. He was pale, his hair a shock of dark curls against the white pillow. His eyes were open but vacant, staring at a point on the ceiling. In his thin hand he clutched a small, worn wooden horse, its paint faded from years of handling. The departing nurse, a woman with a professionally detached air, ran through the protocols. The complex schedule of medications, the nutrient paste for the feeding tube, the rotation schedule to prevent bed sores. "There's no point in speaking to him," the nurse said, her voice matter of fact. "He won't hear you. It's just a matter of keeping him comfortable until the end." Ilara nodded, her heart heavy. She watched the nurse leave, then turned back to the small boy in the bed. She pulled a chair to his bedside, not too close, and simply sat. She didn't speak. She didn't touch him. She just sat with him, sharing the silence. The minutes stretched into an hour. The only sounds were the beeping monitors and the distant crash of waves against the shore. Then she heard it. A deep, resonant chime echoed from the grand hall. It was the old grandfather clock marking the hour. As the final chime faded, Ilara saw it. A flicker. In the periphery of Leo's vacant gaze, his right eye had twitched. A minuscule, almost imperceptible movement toward the door, in the direction of the sound. It was so small, so fleeting, that anyone else would have dismissed it as an involuntary muscle spasm. But Ilara had spent years watching for the smallest signs, the faintest glimmers of connection in the face of a loved one locked away by illness. She knew what she had seen. It wasn't a spasm, it was a reaction. And in that silent, sterile room, that tiny flicker of awareness was a defiant spark in the suffocating darkness of his diagnosis. Ilara's days settled into a quiet, deliberate rhythm, a stark contrast to the rigid, clinical protocols she had inherited. She administered Leo's medications and managed his feeding tube with meticulous care, but she refused to treat him as the empty vessel everyone else saw. Her work began not with the charts, but with the room itself. On her second day, she untied the heavy velvet curtains, pushing them back to let the pale morning light spill across the floor. The room, which had been a tomb, was suddenly illuminated, dust motes dancing in the sunbeams. She opened a window, just a crack, allowing the salty scent of the ocean and the cry of distant gulls to permeate the sterile air. Alistair, watching from the security feed on the tablet in his study, felt a surge of irritation. The light could be jarring. The sounds could be disruptive. The protocols were designed for minimal stimulation to keep Leo in a state of placid rest. He saw her moving about the room, humming a low, tuneless melody to herself, and his finger hovered over the intercom button, ready to reprimand her. But he stopped. He remembered the flicker of something in her eyes during the interview, a stubborn resilience that intrigued him despite himself. He would give her a week. Ilara saw herself not as a nurse, but as a tender of a neglected garden. She believed that even in the most barren soil, a seed of life could be coaxed to grow if given the right conditions. Her experiments were small, gentle acts of rebellion against the grim verdict of medical science. The grandfather clock chimed again at noon, and she watched Leo's face intently. There it was again, the same subtle twitch, the briefest shift of his eye. It was consistent. It was a response. Her next experiment was with scent. The room smelled of bleach and sickness. On her day off, she took a walk along the cliff path and returned with a small bundle of wild lavender and seagrass. She placed them in a simple glass vase on the windowsill, far enough from the bed not to be overwhelming. The faint, clean scent slowly began to replace the chemical odor. She watched Leo. His nostrils flared almost imperceptibly. Another data point, another crack in the wall of his supposed unresponsiveness. She found the kitchen, a vast stainless steel cavern that was clearly a chef's domain, but was now mostly used by staff to prepare Alistair's Spartan meals. In the pantry, she discovered organic vegetables and chicken stock. The nurse had told her Leo's prescribed nutrient paste was all he could tolerate, but Alara remembered the comfort of her grandmother's soup, the way the aroma alone could feel like a hug. She began to simmer simple, fragrant broths. She wouldn't dare put them in his feeding tube, not yet. But she would leave the kitchen door ajar, and the scent of rosemary, thyme, and simmering chicken would drift up the grand staircase and down the hall. A fragrant ghost of home-cooked comfort. Alistair noticed the change in the house's scent. It was unsettling. It reminded him of Amelia, of a time when the kitchen was the heart of their home, filled with laughter and the chaos of a happy family. The smell was an intrusion, a painful echo of a life that was gone forever. He almost told Alara to stop, but then he noticed something on the monitor. Leo's breathing pattern, usually shallow and even, had deepened slightly. It was a small thing, but in a world measured by blips on a screen, it was significant. Alara's greatest discovery came from a place of deep sadness. One evening, while dusting the silent, unused living room, she found a cabinet filled with Amelia's old vinyl records. There were jazz albums, classical symphonies, folk singers. It was a collection curated with love and passion. On a whim, she brought a small portable record player into Leo's room. She chose a record of simple piano lullabies. She placed the needle on the vinyl, and a soft, gentle melody filled the silence. The faint crackle of the record, a warm and organic sound against the cold electronic beeps of the monitors. She sat in her usual chair, watching Leo. For a long time there was nothing. Then, as the melody of a particularly simple, poignant lullaby began, his fingers, which were wrapped tightly around the small wooden horse, twitched once, twice. They relaxed their grip for a fraction of a second before clenching again. It was the most significant motor function she had seen. It was a direct physical response to an external stimulus. He wasn't just hearing, he was feeling. The music was reaching him, somewhere deep inside the prison of his own body. Alara felt tears well in her eyes. It was more than a clue. It was a key. She just had to find the right door to unlock. She played the lullaby again, and the boy's fingers twitched again. A tiny rhythmic dance in time with the music he wasn't supposed to be able to hear. The third week of Alara's tenure marked a turning point, a moment when fragile hope began to crystallize into firm conviction. She had established a routine, a gentle sensory tapestry woven from light, sound, and scent. The piano lullaby became a daily ritual. Each time she played it, she noticed Leo's reactions growing infinitesimally stronger. The twitch in his fingers became a slight flex of his wrist. The flicker in his eyes became a more sustained, if still unfocused, gaze in the direction of the sound. These were her secrets, small victories in a silent war that only she seemed to be fighting. Alistair was away on a necessary week-long business trip to Asia. It was a trip he had postponed twice, hating the thought of being so far from Leo, yet also tormented by the helplessness of being near him. The distance gave Alara a strange sense of freedom. Without the constant, invisible weight of his grief and skepticism, she felt bolder. She began to speak to Leo, not in the loud, cheerful tones of the previous nurses, but in a low, soft murmur. She didn't ask him questions or expect a response. She simply narrated her day, described the weather outside his window, or read passages from an old book of fairy tales she'd found in the library. "The clouds look like giant ships today," she whispered one afternoon, looking out at the Atlantic, "sailing on a gray sea just like the one out there." She continued her reading, her voice a steady, calming presence in the room. She was in the middle of a story about a prince turned into a wooden toy when she heard it, a sound from the bed. It wasn't a cough or a moan. It was a rasp, a dry, guttural exhalation of air that had a shape to it. It was a sound of effort, of intent. Ilara's heart stopped. She slowly lowered the book, her eyes fixed on Leo. He was looking at her, not through her or past her, but at her. His gaze was cloudy, unfocused, but it was directed at her face. And then he made the sound again, a rough, scratchy syllable. "Ah!" Tears streamed down Ilara's face. She didn't move, didn't make a sound that might startle him. She just smiled through her tears, a wide, trembling smile of pure, unadulterated joy. He was in there. He was fighting. He had heard her. He was trying to answer. It wasn't a word, but it was a voice the world had pronounced silent forever. Later that week, another miracle occurred, this one quieter but just as profound. She was cleaning around his bed, humming the now familiar piano lullaby. As she reached to straighten his blanket, he shifted his arm, and the small wooden horse he always clutched fell from his grasp, landing softly on the floor. It was the first time she had ever seen him let it go. Instinctively, she bent down and picked it up. She held it for a moment, feeling the smooth, worn wood in her palm. It felt like a sacred object, a totem of his locked-away childhood. She turned to place it back on the bedside table, but a slight movement caught her eye. Leo's hand, which usually lay limp at his side when not holding the horse, was lifted a few inches off the mattress. His fingers were slightly curled, his palm facing up. It was an unmistakable gesture, an offering, a request. He wanted it back. Her breath hitched. This was not an involuntary spasm. This was a complex sequence. He had registered the loss of the object, identified its new location in her hand, and initiated a voluntary motor action to request its return. It was a chain of cognitive events that his diagnosis said was utterly impossible. With a hand that trembled slightly, Ilara gently placed the wooden horse back into his open palm. His fingers curled around it immediately, the familiar grip a source of comfort. But before he pulled his hand back, his thumb brushed against her skin. The touch was feather-light, fleeting, but it was electric. It was a connection, a bridge across the silent chasm that separated his world from hers. Ilara sank into her chair, overwhelmed. She had her proof. The diagnosis wasn't just incomplete, it was fundamentally wrong. The boy in that bed was not a ghost in a machine. He was a prisoner, and she had just been given the first glimpse of the key to his cell. When Alistair Sterling returned, she would no longer be just his son's caregiver. She would be his advocate, and she would not be silenced. Alistair returned from Tokyo feeling as if he'd aged a decade. The trip had been a success by every metric of the business world, but each handshake, each signed contract, felt like a hollow victory. He walked back into his mausoleum of a home, the silence pressing in on him. The first thing he did, before even taking off his coat, was access the security feed on his study's monitor. He expected to see the same grim tableau, the dim room, the still form in the bed, the caregiver sitting by like a silent sentinel. Instead, the image on the screen jolted him. The room was bright with afternoon sun. The woman, Ilara, was sitting close to the bed, an open book in her lap, and she was reading aloud. He saw her reach out and adjust Leo's pillow. He saw her humming. His immediate reaction was a flash of hot anger. This was the opposite of the minimal stimulation protocol. This was a theatrical performance of care for an audience who couldn't see or hear. It was unprofessional. It was, he thought with a surge of bitter resentment, a mockery of their situation, a pantomime of hope in a hopeless place. He strode down the hall, his footsteps sharp and angry on the marble floor. He pushed open the door to Leo's room without knocking. Elara looked up, startled. The calm, peaceful atmosphere was shattered by his thunderous presence. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Elara slowly closed the book and stood up. She wasn't intimidated. "I was reading to him?" "Reading to him?" Alistair's laugh was a harsh, ugly sound. "The doctors have been clear. He has no cognitive awareness. He can't hear you. He can't understand you. All of this—" He gestured around the bright room, at the vase of wildflowers, the record player, "is for you, not for him. It is a violation of the medical plan. I hired you to provide care, not to engage in this sentimental nonsense." "It's not nonsense," Elara said, her voice quiet but firm. "He is responding." "Responding?" Alistair stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. "I have watched him every day for 2 years. I have seen the world's leading specialists attach every kind of monitor to his brain. There is nothing there. You are a new employee, projecting your own wishes onto a tragic situation. I've seen it before. You will pack your things. You're dismissed." The words hung in the air, cold and final. Elara felt a wave of panic, not for her job, but for Leo. If she left, he would be plunged back into the dark, silent world they had designated for him. The flicker of life she had so carefully nurtured would be extinguished. "No," she said. Alistair was taken aback. No one said no to him. "What did you say?" "Please," she implored, her voice softening, "don't do this. Give me a chance to show you. Just watch." He saw the desperation in her eyes, but it wasn't the desperation of someone about to lose a job. It was something else, something fierce and protective. It was the look of a true believer. Against every rational instinct, against the mountain of medical evidence and his own crushing grief, a tiny, traitorous sliver of curiosity wedged itself into his heart. "You have 2 minutes," he said, folding his arms, his posture radiating skepticism. Elara turned to the small record player. Her hands were shaking slightly as she placed the needle onto the vinyl. The simple piano lullaby began to play, the melody that had become their secret language. She looked at Leo, her heart pounding. "Please, Leo, please show him—" For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. Leo lay perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. Alistair let out a short, cynical sigh. "As I said—" But then it began. Leo's fingers, wrapped around the wooden horse, twitched. His head, which had been locked in the same position for as long as Alistair could remember, began to turn on the pillow. It was an agonizingly slow, deliberate movement, the motion of atrophied muscles being forced into service by a powerful will. His head turned until his cloudy eyes were facing in the direction of his father. Alistair froze. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't possible. Elara began to hum along with the melody, her voice soft and encouraging, and then Leo's hand, the one not holding the horse, lifted from the bed. It trembled with the effort, but it rose, reaching out. Not just randomly, but in the space between Elara and Alistair. His mouth opened, and the same rough guttural sound he had made for Elara emerged, louder this time, more defined. "Da... The sound, a fractured, desperate attempt at the word Dad, shattered Alistair Sterling's world. The carefully constructed walls of cynicism and resignation he had built around his heart crumbled into dust. This wasn't a muscle spasm. This wasn't a reflex. This was his son. His son was in there, and he was trying to reach him. Alistair stumbled back a step, his hand going to his mouth. A sob, raw and painful, tore itself from his chest. He hadn't cried since Amelia's funeral. He had thought he was empty of tears, but now they flowed freely, hot and unstoppable. He sank into the visitor's chair, his powerful frame shaking with the force of his emotions. The anger, the grief, the despair, it all gave way to a wave of something he had not allowed himself to feel in years, a fragile, terrifying, overwhelming hope. He looked from his son who was looking at him, to the woman standing by the bed. Ilara's face was wet with her own tears, but she was smiling. She had seen it all along. She had listened to the silence and heard a voice. How? Alistair whispered, his voice cracking. I listened, Ilara said simply. I just listened to him. The alliance was forged in that moment, in the sunlit room filled with music and tears. The war for Leo's life had a new general, and for the first time, Alistair Sterling was ready to follow someone else's lead. The study, once Alistair's cold fortress of solitude, became their shared command center. Night after night, after the household staff had retired and the mansion was cloaked in silence, Alistair and Ilara would convene. The massive mahogany desk was no longer a symbol of power, but a workspace, buried under stacks of medical files, binders filled with lab results, and timelines of Leo's steady decline. For Alistair, it was a painful pilgrimage through 2 years of failure. For Ilara, it was a search for a pattern, for a single thread that, if pulled, might unravel the whole horrifying tapestry. Alistair, with his analytical mind trained to find inefficiencies in global supply chains, attacked the data with grim determination. He built spreadsheets, cross-referencing dates of specialist visits, environmental changes, and every recorded physiological response. But he was too close to it, his vision clouded by the medical jargon and the authority of the men who had delivered the grim pronouncements. Ilara's approach was different. She had no medical training, but she had an intuitive understanding of care. She looked not at the numbers, but at the narrative they told. She sat beside Alistair, her quiet presence a calming counterpoint to his coiled intensity, and she asked simple questions that cut through the complexity. "This lead specialist," she said one night, her finger tracing the name on a consultation report. "Dr. Marcus Finch. He's been on the case from the very beginning?" "Yes," Alistair said, rubbing his temples. "Marcus is a friend. He knew Amelia since medical school. He's the foremost expert in pediatric neurodegenerative diseases. When Leo first started showing symptoms, he was the only person I trusted." Ilara fell silent, but she tapped the name again. Doctor. Finch's signature was on nearly every prescription, every adjustment to the protocol. He was the architect of Leo's treatment plan. She began to focus on the medication logs. "Tell me about these adjustments," she said, pointing to a series of dates. "Every 3 months, the dosage of this primary compound was increased. What happened after these increases?" Alistair pulled up the corresponding nursing notes. His face grew pale as he read. After each dosage increase, Leo had suffered a severe regression, a period of seizures, followed by a marked decrease in the low-level brain activity the monitors were designed to track. The doctors had called these predictable progressions of the disease. But laid out in chronological order, it looked less like a progression and more like a series of poisonings. "They said it was necessary," Alistair murmured, his voice hollow, "that the disease was aggressive and we had to be aggressive in fighting it." "What if the fight was the thing that was hurting him?" Ilara whispered. The idea was monstrous, a betrayal of the highest order, but it fit the facts. It explained why Leo was improving with her simple, non-medical interventions. She had removed the negative stimuli and replaced them with positive ones. What if the most negative stimulus of all was the medicine itself? The key they needed, however, was not in the medical files. It came from the past, from a source they'd never expected. One afternoon, Alistair mentioned that Amelia had kept meticulous records of everything, not just medical files, but journals. He had packed away all of her personal effects, unable to bear the sight of them. He led Alara to a locked room in the east wing, a room that had been Amelia's office. It was preserved exactly as she had left it, coated in a fine layer of dust. While Alistair searched a large filing cabinet, Alara was drawn to the antique writing desk by the window. She ran her hand over the polished wood. It felt different from the rest of the house. It felt warm, alive. On an impulse, she tried the drawers. All were unlocked except for one, a small one on the right-hand side. "It's stuck," she said. Alistair came over. He jiggled it, then used a letter opener to pry it gently. With a soft click, the drawer slid open. It was empty except for a small, leather-bound book tucked into the very back. It was a journal, Amelia's journal. They sat together on the floor of the dusty office and read. The early entries were filled with a mother's love and worry, charting Leo's first symptoms. But as the months went on, a new, darker thread emerged. Amelia, a sharp and intelligent woman with a background in biochemical research, had her own doubts. October 12th, one entry read, "Marcus was here today. He upped Leo's dosage again. I don't understand the logic. The clinical trials for this compound are so limited. When I press him for data, he becomes defensive. He says I'm just a grieving mother, that I need to trust him. But Leo seems worse after he leaves, more distant. A few weeks later, I did some digging into Finch's research. He's heavily funded by a small boutique pharmaceutical firm, Ferrin Corp. They're the ones who developed Leo's primary medication. It feels too convenient." Then came the final entry, dated 2 days before her death. The handwriting was rushed, frantic. "He's lying. I found the original diagnostic scans I insisted on getting from a lab in Switzerland. They don't match the ones Finch put in Leo's official file. The protein markers are wrong. It's not PNE. It's something else, something milder. My God, what is he giving my son? I have to talk to Alistair. Marcus is coming over tonight. I'm going to confront him." Alistair stared at the page, his hands shaking. Amelia hadn't died from a random, tragic aneurysm. She had been on the verge of exposing the man he called his friend. She had been silenced. And Dr. Finch had been coming to their home that night. The journal was the artifact that changed everything. It transformed their investigation from a search for medical answers into a hunt for a monster who wore a doctor's coat. The grief Alistair felt for his wife was now mingled with a cold, righteous fury. He had not just lost his wife, she had been taken from him, and the same man who was responsible was now slowly, methodically killing his son. The weight of Amelia's last words settled upon them in the dusty, silent room. The journal was no longer just a collection of a mother's worries. It was a testament, a final desperate cry for help from beyond the grave. Alistair held the small book in his hands as if it were a holy relic, its pages containing both the poison and the antidote for his life. The truth was far worse than he could have ever imagined. It wasn't a tragedy of fate or a failure of medicine. It was a deliberate, calculated act of evil, perpetrated by a man he had welcomed into his home, a man he had trusted with the two people he loved most in the world. Alistair's grief, which had been a passive, suffocating fog for 2 years, now ignited into a white-hot rage. He was no longer a helpless bystander to his son's decline. He was a man with a target. "He killed her," Alistair said, his voice a low, terrifying growl. "He must have realized she knew. He came here that night, and he killed her." He looked at Alara, his eyes blazing with a pain and fury that was terrifying to behold. "And he has been poisoning my son ever since." The central reveal was not a single moment, but a cascade of horrifying discoveries. Armed with the damning evidence of Amelia's journal, Alistair unleashed the full, formidable power of his wealth and influence. He didn't go to the police, not yet. Finch was too well connected, too respected. A public accusation without irrefutable proof would be dismissed as the ravings of a grief-stricken father. Alistair needed an airtight case. He needed to dismantle Finch's life and reputation brick by brick. He hired a team of private investigators, the best in the world, ex-intelligence agents, and forensic accountants who operated in the shadows. While they began digging into every aspect of Dr. Finch's life, Alistair and Ilara worked on the medical front. Alistair arranged for a sample of Leo's blood to be secretly couriered to a private independent lab in Geneva, the same one Amelia had trusted. The results came back within 48 hours, and they confirmed Amelia's suspicions. Leo showed no genetic markers for progressive neuroencephalopathy. Instead, he had a rare but manageable mitochondrial disorder, one whose symptoms could be mitigated with specific dietary supplements and physical therapy. It was a chronic condition, but it was not a death sentence. The toxicology report was the true bombshell. Leo's blood was saturated with an unapproved, highly toxic experimental compound. It was a sophisticated neurotoxin designed to attack the nervous system and mimic the exact degenerative symptoms of PNE. The very medicine that was supposed to be saving him was, in fact, the weapon that was killing him. Simultaneously, the investigators began to deliver their findings. Dr. Finch was not just a successful doctor, he was a man living far beyond his means, with a mountain of hidden debt from a series of disastrous investments. His salvation was Corp, the pharmaceutical company Amelia had identified. The firm was on the verge of bankruptcy, its entire future riding on a single, miracle drug in its pipeline, a drug designed to treat PNE. Finch was not just a consultant for the company. He was a majority shareholder, having acquired his stake using leveraged funds. The motive clicked into place with sickening clarity. It was a scheme of unimaginable cruelty and greed. Finch needed a high-profile case to fast-track his drug through the FDA's Compassionate Use Program. Who better than the son of billionaire Alistair Sterling? He had falsified the diagnosis, then began poisoning Leo with a compound that created the very symptoms he claimed to be treating. The 3 months to live prognosis wasn't a medical opinion. It was a deadline. Finch's plan was to let Leo decline to the brink of death, then administer his miracle drug, which was likely nothing more than the antidote to the poison, and stage a miraculous recovery. He would be hailed as a savior. The Sterling case would guarantee FDA approval, and his Corp stock would make him one of the richest men on the planet. Amelia had stumbled upon his plan, and he had silenced her, likely using a fast-acting, untraceable substance that would mimic the symptoms of a cerebral aneurysm. He was a monster hiding in plain sight, a wolf who had been guarding the sheep for years. The full picture of his depravity left Alistair and Ilara breathless. They sat in the study, the investigators' report and the Swiss lab results spread across the desk between them, the evidence of Finch's monstrous betrayal laid bare. All this time, Alistair whispered, his voice thick with self-loathing, all this time I was paying him to kill my son. I enforced his protocols. I held Leo down for his injections. I was his accomplice. You didn't know, Ilara said, placing her hand gently on his arm. You trusted him. You were a father trying to save your son. Her words were a small comfort, but the guilt was a chasm that had opened at his feet. He had failed to protect his family in the most fundamental way. His wife was gone, and his son had been tortured for years, all under his own roof. They now had the truth, a truth more poisonous than any compound in Finch's syringes. They had the motive, the means, and the evidence. The next step was to stop him, to save Leo, and to get justice for Amelia. They began to plan their confrontation, to strategize how to unmask the man who had so thoroughly betrayed them. But they underestimated the cunning of their opponent. Dr. Finch had not become a master manipulator without having contingency plans. He had built his reputation on a foundation of lies, and he was prepared to burn the world down to protect it. He knew he was being watched, and he was about to strike back. Dr. Finch was a predator who could sense the subtle shifts in the currents around him, the abrupt cessation of Alistair's daily desperate phone calls, the unusual request for a full transfer of Leo's medical records to an overseas consultant, the discreet inquiries his contacts at the hospital had mentioned, questions about his research funding and his affiliation with Farron Corp. He knew something was wrong. He didn't know how much they knew, but he understood that his carefully constructed world was under threat. And like any cornered animal, he chose to attack first. His retaliation was swift, brutal, and insidious. He used his most powerful weapon, his unimpeachable reputation as a compassionate medical authority. He made a call to a trusted contact at the state's Child Protective Services Division. He painted a deeply disturbing picture, his voice filled with feigned professional concern. He spoke of a grieving, unstable father, Alistair Sterling, who had fallen under the influence of an unqualified and dangerous new caregiver. He described Alara as a woman with a history of unorthodox beliefs, who was practicing medicine without a license. "She's taken him off his life-saving medication," Finch lied, his tone dripping with sorrow. "She's convinced Mr. Sterling that she can cure Leo with music and aromatherapy. The boy is in grave danger. He is being medically neglected. I fear he won't last the week without proper intervention." To bolster his claims, he leaked a carefully crafted story to a notorious tabloid journalist on his payroll. The headline screamed across the front page the next morning, "Tragic Billionaire's Heir in the Grip of Voodoo Nanny." The article was a masterpiece of character assassination, filled with anonymous quotes from concerned former staff, nurses he himself had recommended, and who were loyal to him, about Alara's strange humming, her insistence on opening windows, and her bizarre rituals. It portrayed Alistair as a man so broken by grief that he had become a danger to his own child. The consequences were immediate. 2 stone-faced CPS agents arrived at the Sterling mansion the following afternoon, armed with a court order. Alistair and Alara were in Leo's room, celebrating a small victory. Leo had, for the first time, managed to drink a few sips of broth from a spoon when the butler announced the unwelcome visitors. The meeting in the cavernous living room was a nightmare. The agents were unmoved by Alistair's furious protests and his talk of a conspiracy. All they saw was what Finch had told them to see: a powerful, potentially unstable man and a caregiver with no medical credentials. The tabloid article lay on the table between them like a venomous snake. "Mr. Sterling, based on the credible report from Dr. Finch, Leo's primary physician, we have been granted an emergency order," the lead agent said, her voice devoid of emotion. "Ms. Vance is to have no further contact with the child, pending a full investigation. She needs to vacate the premises immediately." "That's insane!" Alistair roared, rising to his feet. "She's the only one who has helped him. The doctor is the one trying to kill him." His outburst only served to confirm their suspicions. He sounded exactly like the unhinged man Finch had described. "If you obstruct our investigation, we will be forced to remove the child from your custody as well," the agent said calmly. The threat hung in the air, a blade pressed to Alistair's throat. He looked at Alara, his face a mask of helpless fury. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "Don't fight them, not like this." She understood that a battle here would be a battle lost. Alara packed a small bag in silence, her heart breaking with every item she folded. Leaving Leo now felt like a physical amputation. She had just coaxed him back toward the light, and now he was being plunged back into darkness, back into the hands of the man who was poisoning him. As she walked toward the front door, escorted by one of the agents, she passed the bottom of the grand staircase. She looked up toward Leo's room and whispered, "Be strong, little one. I'll be back." The separation was devastating. Alistair was forced to allow a new team of nurses, all approved by Dr. Finch, to take over Leo's care. He watched on the monitors as they immediately reinstated the old protocol. The curtains were drawn, the record player was removed, and the nutrient paste and heavy medications were administered on schedule. Leo's regression was immediate and catastrophic. Within a day, the light in his eyes dimmed. He stopped responding to his father's voice. He refused to even try to take the broth, turning his head away. He once again became the still, silent figure in the bed, his only connection to the world the small wooden horse clutched tightly in his hand. Finch's poison was once again flowing through his veins, and the fragile progress Ilara had made was being systematically erased. The crisis had arrived, tearing their nascent family apart and leaving Leo more vulnerable than ever. The forced separation from Leo transformed Alistair Sterling. The last vestiges of the grieving, passive man were burned away, replaced by a cold, focused fury. He was no longer just a father fighting for his son. He was a king whose kingdom was under siege, and he would deploy every weapon in his considerable arsenal. Finch had made a critical error. He had mistaken Alistair's grief for weakness. He was about to learn the difference. Alistair's first move was to secure Ilara. He put her up in a suite at a 5-star hotel, ensuring her comfort and safety, and hired a personal security detail to protect her from any further harassment. The hotel suite became their new war room. While legally barred from seeing Leo, Ilara's mind and her memory were their most crucial assets. She could recall every detail of Leo's reactions, every nuance of the medical charts, every word of Amelia's journal. "He's using the system against us," Alistair said, pacing the length of the suite. His phone pressed to his ear as he spoke to a squadron of lawyers. "So we'll use a bigger system against him." He assembled a legal team that was the stuff of corporate legend, the kind of lawyers who dismantled monopolies and brought governments to their knees. Their first task was to fight the CPS order, to bury the agency in so much paperwork and counter-motions that they would be forced to expedite their investigation. They filed defamation suits against the tabloid, targeting not just the publication but the journalist himself, immediately freezing his assets and demanding he reveal his source. While the legal battle raged on one front, Alistair launched a covert operation on another. His private investigators, who had previously been digging for financial dirt, were now tasked with finding a human element, someone inside Finch's operation who could be turned. They focused on Corp. They discovered a recently fired lab assistant, a young woman named Dr. Eris Thorne, who had been dismissed for insubordination after raising ethical concerns about the PNE drug trials. Alistair met with her himself. He didn't threaten or bribe her. He simply laid out the facts. He showed her the independent lab results from Geneva. He let her read Amelia's journal. He told her about his son. Dr. Thorne, a brilliant but principled scientist who had been railroaded by Finch, saw a chance for redemption. She agreed to sign a sworn affidavit and testify. She was their smoking gun. Dr. Thorne had witnessed Finch personally ordering the falsification of trial data. She had copies of internal memos where he demanded the lab ignore the compound's extreme neurotoxicity. She knew the so-called miracle drug was nothing more than a chelating agent designed specifically to bind to and flush out the very poison he was administering. Her testimony would destroy him. The final piece of the puzzle was getting unimpeachable, current proof from Leo himself. Alistair couldn't simply take another blood sample. The new nurses watched him like hawks. So he devised a plan. He feigned a complete breakdown of trust in the CPS-appointed nurses, demanding that Leo be moved to the hospital for impartial, round-the-clock observation. He used his influence on the hospital's board of directors to make it happen. He knew Finch would object, but to do so would look suspicious. Reluctantly, Finch agreed, confident that his own people at the hospital would control the situation. It was exactly the move Alistair needed. Once Leo was on hospital grounds, Alistair's legal team could file an emergency court order for a new court-mandated toxicology screening to be performed by a neutral third party. The trap was set. The confrontation would not be a quiet meeting or a dramatic outburst. Alistair, using his leverage as the hospital's single largest benefactor, arranged for an emergency hearing of the Medical Ethics Board. He requested that Dr. Finch be present to address some concerns the family had about Leo's care. Finch arrived arrogant and composed. He saw a broken father lashing out, a final pathetic act of denial. He was ready to calmly and compassionately put Alistair in his place, solidifying his own position as the voice of reason and authority. He walked into the hospital's main boardroom. It was not the small, informal meeting he expected. The entire executive board was present. Alistair Sterling sat at the head of the table, flanked by his team of lawyers. And standing quietly by the window, her presence a silent accusation, was Ilara Vance. Finch's composure flickered for the briefest of moments. He realized this was not a hearing. It was an ambush. The hospital boardroom was cold and sterile, a fitting arena for the clinical execution of a reputation. Dr. Finch took his seat, attempting to project an air of calm authority, but a knot of unease was tightening in his stomach. He looked at Alistair, whose face was like carved granite, and at Ilara, whose quiet gaze felt heavier than any accusation. "Thank you for coming, Marcus," Alistair began, his voice dangerously soft. The use of Finch's first name was a deliberate, intimate strike. "We're here today because of a series of profound discoveries regarding my son's health. Discoveries that seem to contradict your diagnosis and treatment plan for the past 2 years." Alistair's lead attorney, a formidable woman named Clara Rowe, took the floor. She didn't raise her voice. She simply presented the facts with the chilling precision of a surgeon. She began by projecting Amelia Sterling's original Swiss diagnostic scans onto the large screen at the front of the room, followed by the falsified scans from Finch's file. "Dr. Finch," she said, "can you explain to the board why these 2 sets of scans taken from the same patient on the same day show entirely different protein markers?" Finch blanched. He stammered about different testing methodologies, about the unreliability of foreign labs, but the evidence was stark and undeniable. The foundation of his diagnosis was a lie. Next, Clara presented the financial investigation. Detailed charts showed Finch's spiraling debt, his leveraged acquisition of Fearon Corp stock, and the direct correlation between his financial desperation and the escalation of Leo's treatment. "It appears, Doctor," Clara said, her voice dripping with contempt, "that your medical judgment was compromised by a rather significant conflict of interest." Finch began to sweat. He blustered about patient confidentiality, about the slanderous nature of these accusations, but his defense was weak and growing weaker by the second. Then the boardroom doors opened and Dr. Eris Thorne walked in. She looked directly at her former boss, her expression a mixture of fear and resolve. She took a seat, and under oath, she recounted everything: the falsified data, the suppressed reports on the compound's toxicity, Finch's explicit instructions to ignore adverse reactions in lab animals. Her testimony was a devastating, systematic demolition of his professional integrity. He called it acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of a breakthrough, Dr. Thorne concluded, her voice trembling with anger. But they weren't just data points, they were lives. The room was silent, the board members staring at Finch with expressions of horror and disgust. He was ashen, his arrogance shattered, replaced by the frantic, wild-eyed look of a trapped animal. "This is a conspiracy," he croaked, looking at Alistair. "He's a grieving man. He's unstable. He's manipulated this a hysterical young woman. Alistair didn't even flinch. He simply nodded to Clara Rowe. "And finally," Clara announced, "we have the results of the court-ordered toxicology report, drawn from Mr. Sterling's son this morning." A hospital administrator entered the room and handed the sealed report to the chairman of the board. The chairman opened it, read it, and his face went slack with shock. He looked up at Finch, his eyes filled with utter revulsion. "Dr. Finch," the chairman said, his voice shaking with rage, "according to this report, Leo Sterling's blood contains a level of an unclassified experimental neurotoxin that is, frankly, incompatible with life. There are 0 markers for progressive neuroencephalopathy. You have been poisoning this child." It was over. The final irrefutable proof. Finch lunged to his feet, a desperate, guttural sound of denial escaping his lips. But 2 uniformed security guards who had been waiting outside the door stepped in, each taking one of his arms. His reign of terror, built on lies and a syringe, had ended. The board voted unanimously and immediately to revoke his medical license and hospital privileges pending the inevitable criminal charges. As Finch was being led away, his face contorted in a mask of impotent fury, the CPS emergency order was officially rescinded. Alistair looked at Ilara, his eyes conveying a depth of gratitude that words could never capture. "Let's go get our son," he said. They didn't wait. They ran through the hospital corridors to the pediatric wing. When they entered Leo's room, he was lying still, the new nurses looking up in surprise. Alistair dismissed them with a wave of his hand. Ilara walked slowly to the bed. Leo's eyes were dull, his face pale. The poison was still doing its work. She sat on the edge of the mattress and took his small hand in hers. It was cold. "Leo," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "it's me. It's Ilara. It's over now. You're safe." She began to hum their lullaby, the simple piano melody that had first bridged the silence between them. For a moment there was no response. Then, slowly, his eyelids fluttered. His head turned on the pillow. His eyes, cloudy but aware, found hers. A tiny, fragile smile touched his lips. He squeezed her hand. Alistair watched from the doorway, tears streaming down his face. It was a scene of resurrection. The vindication was not just in the boardroom, in the defeat of a monster. It was here, in this small, quiet room. It was in the return of a smile to his son's face. Ilara had not just saved Leo's life, she had given him back his own. She had given them back their family. 1 year later, the Sterling mansion was unrecognizable. The sterile, tomb-like silence had been replaced by the echoes of laughter and the joyful sounds of a child's running footsteps. Sunlight, no longer an intruder, streamed through the vast windows, illuminating rooms that were now filled with color, warmth, and life. The cold marble floors were covered with soft rugs, and family photographs of Leo, of Ilara, of Alistair, and even a smiling one of Amelia, adorned the walls. The disused greenhouse, a skeletal structure of glass and steel when Ilara had first arrived, had become her sanctuary. Now it was a lush, verdant paradise, overflowing with fragrant blossoms, climbing vines, and rows of organic vegetables. It was here that she and Leo spent most of their afternoons, tending to the plants, their hands in the rich soil. Leo was a different child. The poison had been painstakingly flushed from his system, and with the proper therapy and supplements for his actual mitochondrial condition, he was thriving. He was still smaller than other boys his age, and he sometimes struggled with his coordination, but his mind was sharp, his curiosity boundless. He was walking, talking, and filling the once silent halls with questions about everything from the stars in the sky to the worms in the garden. He was enrolled in a small private school that specialized in children with unique needs, and he was, by all accounts, the brightest student in his class. Alistair was a different man. The ruthless, grief-stricken recluse was gone. He had delegated most of the day-to-day operations of his empire, choosing instead to work from his home office its doors, all was open. He never missed a chance to kick a soccer ball with Leo on the lawn or to join him and Alara in the greenhouse. The haunted look in his eyes had been replaced by a deep, abiding peace. His relationship with Alara had evolved naturally, quietly, from one of employer and employee to one of partners. They were a team, bound not by a formal declaration, but by the shared crucible of their fight for Leo and a profound, unspoken love built on a foundation of mutual respect and admiration. The culmination of their new life came on a warm autumn evening. Alistair was hosting a grand charity gala at the mansion to launch the Amelia Sterling Foundation, an organization dedicated to advocating for patients and exposing medical fraud. The house was filled with hundreds of people, the air buzzing with conversation and the gentle strains of a string quartet. After a series of speeches from doctors and patient advocates, Alistair took the stage. He looked out over the crowd, his gaze finding Alara, who stood in the wings holding Leo's hand. 2 years ago, my life was defined by loss and despair, Alistair began, his voice clear and strong. I believed that wealth and power were the ultimate measures of a man. I was wrong. The greatest measure of our humanity is our capacity to care, to listen, and to fight for those who cannot fight for themselves. He spoke of Amelia's courage, of Finch's betrayal, and of the darkness that had almost consumed them. But light can be found in the most unexpected of places, he continued, his eyes locking with Alara's. It can be found in a quiet voice that refuses to be silenced. It can be found in an act of kindness that expects nothing in return. I and my son were saved by such a light. He then invited Leo to the stage. Dressed in a small tuxedo, Leo walked confidently to the podium, which was almost as tall as he was. He looked out at the sea of faces, unafraid. My first mom, Amelia, was a hero, Leo said, his voice clear and sweet. And my second mom, Alara, is one too. And my dad is the strongest person I know. They saved me. He smiled a bright, radiant smile. Thank you for helping us help other kids like me. The applause was thunderous, a wave of emotion that washed over the room. Alistair scooped Leo into his arms, and Alara joined them on the stage. Alistair wrapped his free arm around her shoulders, pulling her close in a gesture that was both protective and deeply affectionate. A public declaration for all to see. The three of them stood together, bathed in the warm stage lights. Not a broken man, a hired caregiver, and a sick child, but a family, whole and healed. As the evening wound down and the last of the guests departed, they stood on the terrace watching the moon rise over the calm ocean. Leo, sleepy but happy, was nestled between them. They had faced the darkest parts of human nature and had emerged into the light, not unscathed but stronger and more deeply connected than ever. The experience had taught them a profound lesson, that in a world so often swayed by wealth and authority, the most powerful truths are often discovered not through power, but through patience, not through loud pronouncements, but through the quiet act of listening to the whispers of the human heart. And before we sign off, we just want to say thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video if you enjoyed the story. We'd also love to hear from you, so please comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from. We'll see you in the next video.